I tried to settle back into my game, but something just felt wrong. You know that feeling when the air around you seems too quiet, like the calm before a storm? That's how it felt. The house, which usually had its little creaks and groans, had gone dead silent. Even the fridge, which always made this annoying hum, had stopped. I couldn't focus on the screen anymore. I muted the game and sat there for a moment, listening, hoping that maybe the eerie feeling would go away. It didn't. Instead, I started hearing something again, a faint sound, but this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was closer, almost like it was coming from the hallway right outside the living room. I leaned forward, holding my breath, straining to hear. At first, it sounded like a soft tapping, something light, maybe fingers drumming against a wall or the floor. The kind of noise that could easily be brushed off as the house settling. But it didn't stop. The tapping kept going, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was doing it on purpose. I stood up, every nerve in my body on edge now. Okay, this is getting weird, I whispered to myself. I wanted to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I even thought maybe the wind had found another way into the house and was making things move around again. But deep down, I knew this felt different. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, even though the lights were still on. It felt safer somehow, like I had a shield between me and whatever was making that sound. I walked toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to keep my breathing steady. As I stepped into the hallway, the tapping stopped. Just like that, silence. I scanned the area with my flashlight. Even though I could see everything perfectly fine with the lights on, there was nothing there. The doors to all the rooms were closed, and everything seemed exactly how I'd left it. I laughed nervously. "You're losing it," I muttered, shaking my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I needed to call it a night and go to bed. But then, as I stood there, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. One of the picture frames hanging on the wall was slightly crooked. It was tilted just enough that it caught my attention. I didn't remember it being like that earlier. I stepped closer, reaching out to straighten it, when I noticed something else, a thin line of dust on the floor beneath the picture, like someone had dragged their fingers through it, leaving long, uneven marks. My stomach did a flip. What the hell? I crouched down to get a closer look, running my hand over the dusty marks. They were fresh. Someone or something had touched the floor here. But how? I had been in the living room the whole time, and no one else was in the house. I was sure of it. I stood up quickly, my hands shaking a little now. I took a step back, my heart racing even faster. I tried to think of any logical explanation. Maybe it was there before and I just hadn't noticed. Or maybe my sister had done it when she was home earlier and I just hadn't seen it. But none of that made sense. The dust was too fresh. It had been disturbed recently. Suddenly, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the kitchen. And it wasn't soft anymore. It was louder, like someone was knocking on the countertop or the table. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I go check it out? Should I just leave the house and wait for my parents to come back tomorrow? But that seemed ridiculous. It's my house, after all. I couldn't just run away from it. Taking a deep breath, I turned toward the kitchen. It's nothing, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. Just go check. It'll be fine. I walked toward the kitchen, my phone's flashlight still on, though the room was well lit. As I stepped inside, the tapping stopped again. The room looked completely normal. The chairs were where I'd left them, the takeout containers still sitting on the counter. Nothing was out of place. I stood there for a minute, scanning every corner of the kitchen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Just silence again. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself down. "You're imagining things," I whispered. "You're just tired. Go back to your game." As I turned to leave the kitchen, I caught sight of something in the window. A reflection. I froze, my eyes locked on the glass. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a shadow standing just outside the window. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just stood there, staring at the reflection, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was someone outside, standing in the darkness, watching me. I whipped around, my phone's flashlight aimed at the window. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The backyard was empty. I stood there in the kitchen, staring out at the empty backyard, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The window was perfectly still. No sign of the shadow I'd just seen in the reflection. No movement, nothing at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, watching me. My breath was coming out in short, shaky bursts. I backed away from the window, trying to keep my cool, but it felt impossible. The silence in the house was deafening now, like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to think straight. I needed to get a grip. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me like it had been with the sounds earlier. I mean, I've been alone for hours, sitting in the quiet, and that kind of isolation messes with you, right? I kept telling myself that over and over, but I didn't believe it. Not really. I turned away from the window, deciding to go back to the living room, maybe turn the TV up loud and drown out the weird vibes. But as soon as I took a step, something caught my eye again. This time, something more concrete. The window in the kitchen wasn't closed all the way. It was open, just a crack. My stomach dropped, and the uneasy feeling I'd had all night turned into full-blown fear. I never leave windows open, especially not downstairs. My mom always made a huge deal about locking everything up when we left the house or when we were alone. I hadn't even thought to check earlier because, in my mind, everything was secure. But now, seeing that tiny gap in the window, I knew something was wrong. I stepped closer to the window, hesitating before reaching out to close it. My hands were shaking. I peered outside one more time, scanning the backyard, looking for any movement, any sign that someone had been there. Still nothing. But the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and that cold knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. I pushed the window shut and locked it, double-checking to make sure it was secure. The lock clicked into place with a finality that made me feel a tiny bit better, but not much. I backed away from the window, my eyes still fixed on it, half expecting it to fly open again on its own. I pulled out my phone and texted Jake, my fingers moving quickly, almost frantically. Me? Dude, I'm freaking out. I think someone's been in my backyard. I waited, staring at the screen, willing him to respond. He wasn't answering right away, which just made me more anxious. I could feel my heart racing, my mind running through a million different scenarios. What if someone had been out there watching me? What if they'd gotten into the house somehow? I glanced around the kitchen again, my eyes darting from the doorway to the corners of the room, as if someone might pop out at any second. But everything was still. Finally, my phone buzzed with a reply. Jake? What do you mean? You see someone? Me? No, but the kitchen window was open. I swear I saw someone's reflection in the glass. I sent the message and waited, biting my lip, trying to keep it together. After what felt like forever, Jake responded again. Jake? Bro, are you sure? Could have been anything. You're home alone. Your mind's probably messing with you. I stared at his message, knowing he was probably right. But that didn't stop the fear gnawing at me, making my skin crawl. The open window wasn't something my mind could make up. That was real. I knew I hadn't left it open, so how could it have been? I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't just brush it off. I texted back. Me? I'm sure. The window was closed earlier. Something feels off. Jake didn't reply right away this time. I stood there, gripping my phone, waiting for him to give me some kind of reassurance, something to calm me down. I kept pacing back and forth in the kitchen, glancing at the window, listening for any sound at all from outside or upstairs. After a minute, my phone buzzed again. Jake? Want me to come over? I'm only like 10 minutes away. For a second, I felt relieved. Having someone else here would definitely make me feel less freaked out. I was just about to reply when I heard it again, a noise from upstairs. This time it wasn't a soft thud or tapping. It was louder, like something heavy had been knocked over. My heart stopped. I turned my head toward the staircase, my pulse pounding in my ears. Someone was upstairs. There was no denying it now. I wasn't imagining things. Without thinking, I texted Jake back, my hands shaking as I typed. Me, someone's upstairs. His response was instant. Jake? Dude, call the cops. I'm coming over right now. I stared at the message, frozen in place. Should I call the cops? What if it was just a squirrel in the attic or something? I didn't want to seem like some scared kid calling 911 over nothing. But at the same time, my gut was telling me that this wasn't nothing. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do. The house was too quiet again, and that silence? It was unbearable. Suddenly, there was a creak from the floorboards above me, and I knew without a doubt there was someone up there. I froze in place, my body locked up in sheer terror. There was no more pretending, no more convincing myself that it was just the house settling or the wind. There was someone in the house upstairs moving around. The sound of creaking floorboards was unmistakable, and it sent a cold chill down my spine. For a split second, I debated whether to run for the front door, just bolt and get out of there as fast as I could. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot in the kitchen, my mind spinning with fear. I thought about what Jake had said. Call the cops. It made sense. I should call. But something inside me didn't want to make that call yet. What if I was overreacting? What if somehow there was a logical explanation for all of this? My brain kept trying to find some way to rationalize it, but nothing felt right. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my hand again. It was Jake. Jake, I'm on my way. Be there soon. Lock the doors. His message made me feel a little bit better, but not by much. I wasn't sure locking the doors was going to help if someone was already inside. I looked around the kitchen, trying to figure out my next move. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast, making it hard to think clearly. Another creak came from above me. This one was closer. It was like whoever was upstairs was moving slowly, deliberately toward the staircase. Toward me. I clenched my phone tighter, trying to keep my breathing steady, but it wasn't working. I was panicking, and I knew it. I needed to do something. Anything. I glanced at the front door, considering making a break for it. But then, another sound hit my ears. Breathing. I could hear it clearly now, a slow, steady breathing coming from somewhere above. Not just the sound of footsteps anymore, but the unmistakable sound of someone inhaling and exhaling, like they were taking their time, savoring the quiet. My blood went cold. Whoever it was, they weren't just moving around randomly. They knew I was there. They were listening, waiting. I took a step back, bumping into the kitchen counter, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible. I couldn't risk going upstairs, not with that sound so close. I glanced toward the basement door. For some reason, it felt like a safer option than the front door. Maybe because I could lock myself in down there, maybe buy some time until Jake arrived. I tiptoed toward the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest, every creak of the floor making me wince. I reached for the doorknob, gripping it tightly, but just as I started to turn it, the breathing stopped. I held my breath, frozen. The air in the house seemed to shift, like everything had suddenly gone still. My skin prickled with fear, and I felt the intense urge to look up toward the staircase. I didn't want to. I knew I didn't want to see whatever, or whoever, was there. But something pulled my eyes upward anyway. And there, at the top of the stairs, just barely visible in the shadows, I saw it. A figure, motionless, standing at the very edge of the top step. I couldn't make out a face, couldn't see any features. Just a shape, dark and looming, watching me. My heart stopped. My throat went dry. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed with fear, my hand still clutching the basement doorknob, as if that flimsy door would protect me from whatever was at the top of those stairs. And then, in the silence, the figure moved. Slowly, one foot in front of the other, it started descending the stairs. Every step was agonizingly slow, deliberate, like it was taking its time, enjoying the fear radiating from me. I had to move. I had to get out. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wasn't responding. I could only stand there, staring at the figure as it got closer and closer, the shadows shifting with each step it took. Finally, something clicked in my brain. Fight or flight. I yanked the basement door open and practically threw myself down the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled to lock it, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it in time. But then I heard the lock click into place, and I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. It was pitch black in the basement. I had dropped my phone somewhere during the frantic dash, but I didn't care. I pressed my ear to the door, listening, praying that whoever or whatever was on the other side would give up and go away. But then I heard it again, that breathing. This time, it was right outside the door, slow and steady, like it knew exactly where I was. Like it had followed me. I stifled a sob, covering my mouth with my hand, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My entire body was trembling, and I could feel my heartbeat pulsing in my throat. The silence stretched on forever, broken only by that horrible, slow breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see anything, maybe it wouldn't be real. Maybe I was dreaming, and I'd wake up in my bed, safe and sound. But deep down, I knew this was real. This was happening. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on the basement door. Just a light tap, but it felt like a gunshot in the silence. My breath hitched, and I bit down on my hand to keep from screaming. And then a voice. Low, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably there. Let me in. I felt like I was going to be sick. My head was spinning, and the walls of the basement seemed to close in on me. I pressed my back harder against the door, as if I could somehow keep that voice out just by sheer force of will. Let me in, it repeated, even softer this time, like a haunting melody. The voice was soft, but it echoed in my ears like a scream. Let me in, it whispered again, sending a jolt of fear down my spine. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with every passing second. I pressed myself harder against the basement door, as if that flimsy piece of wood was the only thing keeping me safe. I was trapped. The basement was cold, damp, and pitch black. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and I could hear the low hum of the water heater in the far corner. But everything else was still. Too still. My mind was racing. I had no way out. The only exit was the door I had just locked, and that thing was right outside. I didn't dare move. My back was pressed so hard against the door that I could feel the wood digging into my skin. My hand was still clamped over my mouth, trying to silence the shaky breaths that kept slipping out. Every sound I made felt like a betrayal, like I was giving myself away. The voice came again, barely a whisper this time. Let me in. It was right there. I could almost feel it on the other side of the door. It wasn't banging or forcing its way in. It was just waiting, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I wanted to scream, to yell, to tell it to go away, but the words were stuck in my throat. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I blinked them back. Crying wasn't going to help. I needed to think. I needed to do something. But what? The basement was a dead end. There was no back door, no window big enough to crawl through. I'd spent enough time down here to know that. The only thing down here besides old boxes and tools was the small window at the very top of the wall. Way too high and too small to escape through. I was completely, utterly trapped. I forced myself to look around, squinting in the darkness, trying to see if there was anything I could use. My phone. I dropped it in my rush down the stairs. If I could find it, I could call Jake, or even the cops. Something. Anything. But the basement was dark, and my phone could have been anywhere. I didn't have much time to think. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. Just one slow, deliberate knock. Then silence again. I bit my lip, holding back the panic that was rising inside me. I had to move. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was outside to come in. I had to find my phone, get some light, and figure out a plan. Slowly, I eased away from the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hands were trembling, my legs felt like they could give out at any second, but I forced myself to keep going. I crouched down, my fingers brushing over the cold cement floor, searching for the phone. Every second felt like an hour. I moved my hands in frantic circles, sweeping the floor, praying I'd feel the smooth surface of my phone. My heart was beating so fast it hurt, and I couldn't stop glancing back at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then, finally, my fingers brushed against something hard and cold. The phone. I grabbed it, clutching it like a lifeline, and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow in the darkness. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped it, but I managed to unlock the phone. I didn't even bother checking for missed messages. I went straight to the keypad to call Jake. Just as I was about to dial, I heard it. Another knock on the door, louder this time. My thumb froze over the screen, and I glanced toward the door again. Then the voice came. "I know you're down there." I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't just some random intruder. They knew I was in the basement. They had been watching me. Panic surged through me, and I started dialing Jake's number. My fingers were shaking, and I almost hit the wrong numbers, but I managed to get it right. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then I heard Jake's voice on the other end. "Dude, what's going on?" he asked, his voice sounding out of breath. "I'm like 5 minutes away. Are you okay?" I could barely speak. "Jake, there's someone in the house. They're right outside the basement door." "What?" His voice got serious. "Stay where you are. I'm almost there. Don't make a sound. I'm calling the cops now." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and ended the call. My fingers hovered over the phone for a second, thinking about calling the cops myself, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Then the sound of footsteps came again, louder this time, pacing back and forth just outside the door. I could hear the heavy thud of boots on the floor above, moving slowly, deliberately. My skin prickled with fear. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then, without warning, the basement door handle rattled. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The handle twisted, but the lock held. Whoever was on the other side wasn't trying to break it down, though. They were testing it slowly, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to open it myself. "I'm coming in," the voice said, low and slow. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone like it could somehow protect me. My eyes darted around the basement, desperate for a place to hide, but there was nowhere. Just the bare walls, the boxes, and the useless window. I heard the sound of the handle rattling again, and then silence. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I strained to hear anything on the other side of the door. Nothing. Had they left? I didn't dare move. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. The slow creak of the basement door echoed in the dark, and I swear my heart stopped. The air in the basement grew heavy, thick with fear. It wasn't the violent crash of someone forcing their way in. No, this was worse. It was deliberate, as if whoever was opening it knew exactly what they were doing, knew exactly how to push me to the edge of terror. The door opened just a crack at first. A sliver of light from the hallway spilled in, cutting through the darkness of the basement. I froze, my back pressed against the far wall, gripping my phone like it was my only lifeline. My breath was shallow, and I forced myself to stay still, to not make a sound. I couldn't see anyone yet, just that thin line of light from the hallway. For a brief, insane second, I thought about rushing the door, slamming it shut before whoever was on the other side could come through. But my legs wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed with fear, as if I was rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but wait. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the door opened wider. Inch by inch, it swung inward. My eyes were locked on the growing gap, my whole body tensed, ready to bolt at any second. I kept thinking, what if they see me? What if they know I'm down here? But then again, they already knew. They had to know. The door stopped halfway open, and I heard it again, the breathing. Deep, slow breaths, like someone standing just on the other side, waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by that steady breathing. My hands shook so badly, I thought I might drop my phone, but I couldn't look away from the door. For a moment, nothing happened. The door stayed still, the house silent. It was almost worse than the footsteps or the knocking. It was the not knowing, the waiting, the anticipation of something terrible. I was expecting the worst, bracing for it. Then, from the shadowy crack in the doorway, I saw it. A hand. It was just a hand at first, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Long fingers wrapped around the wood, almost casually, like whoever was standing there was in no hurry. Like they had all the time in the world. My breath caught in my throat as I watched that hand, frozen in place, waiting for the rest of whoever it was to appear. The door didn't move, though. The figure didn't step through. Just that hand, gripping the doorframe, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. It was a casual, almost mocking gesture, like they knew they had me cornered and were enjoying every second of it. I wanted to scream, to do something, but my voice was trapped inside me, just like my legs were. I couldn't look away. My body refused to obey the desperate commands from my brain. The cold, clammy fear that had gripped me for so long had now turned into a suffocating terror, like being buried alive. And then the voice came again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was soft but more insistent. A calm, chilling voice, like it belonged to someone who knew they had the upper hand. I told you, I'm coming in. My entire body went rigid. The voice was so close, just beyond the door, yet I still couldn't see their face. It was taunting me, and I could hear the faintest hint of a smile in that voice, like this was a game to them. A game I was losing. I backed up further, pressing myself as hard as I could against the cold basement wall, wishing it would swallow me whole. I glanced at my phone, my mind racing. Should I call Jake again? The cops? Maybe I could scream, and Jake would hear me outside. But would that help? Or would it make things worse? Just as I was about to make a move, I heard something else, a distant sound from upstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of the front door opening. My heart leapt in my chest. It had to be Jake. It had to be. He'd said he was on his way. Maybe he was here already. I held my breath, waiting, listening for any sign that it was him. The figure in the doorway must have heard it too, because the hand gripping the doorframe paused, then slowly pulled back. The door creaked slightly as the hand disappeared into the darkness beyond. For a second, I was sure they were gone, but then I heard footsteps again, this time coming from the hallway. Slow, steady footsteps, moving away from the basement door. My pulse quickened. Maybe the person had heard Jake and was retreating. Maybe they didn't want to get caught. I didn't wait to find out. This was my chance. I scrambled to my feet, gripping my phone, and bolted for the stairs. My legs were shaky, adrenaline surging through me, but I pushed myself forward. My hand gripped the railing as I practically launched myself up the steps. I reached the top of the stairs in seconds, and without thinking, I threw the basement door open and rushed into the hallway. The house was dark, but I could hear the faintest sound of movement upstairs. I didn't care anymore. I didn't care if they were still in the house. I had to get out. I turned toward the front door, hoping, praying, that Jake was out there. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could even turn it, the door swung open. Standing there, silhouetted by the faint light from the street, was Jake. "Holy, are you okay?" he shouted, his voice filled with concern. He was out of breath, his face pale, but I'd never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. I practically collapsed into him, my whole body trembling. There was someone in the house. I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. They were in the basement, But before I could finish, Jake grabbed my shoulders and pushed me toward the front steps. "We need to get out of here." I called the cops. "They're on their way." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled out the door, feeling the cool night air hit my face like a splash of water. It was only then that I realized how badly I'd been sweating, how much fear had gripped every part of me. Jake slammed the front door shut behind us, and we stood there on the front lawn, breathing hard, both of us listening, waiting for the sound of sirens. "Did you see them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jake shook his head, his eyes scanning the house. "No, but I heard someone upstairs when I came in. They must have gotten out the back." My mind raced. Whoever had been in the house, they were gone now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been played with, like a cat toys with its prey. They had known I was down there. They'd known exactly how to scare me. I shuddered, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to calm down. Jake stood beside me, silent, but his presence was enough. We were safe now. The cops would be here soon. But as I stared up at the house, at the dark windows that seemed to stare back, I couldn't help but wonder. Had they really left? Or were they still in there, hiding, waiting for another chance? It was a Saturday night, and I was alone at home. My parents had gone away for the weekend, and my little sister was staying at a friend's place. It was just me, the empty house, and a whole lot of silence. To be honest, I was kind of looking forward to it. No one bothering me, no one asking for help with homework or telling me to do chores. Just me, some video games, and maybe a late night movie if I felt like it. After grabbing some takeout from the fridge, I settled down on the couch with my game controller. Everything seemed normal, just the hum of the TV and the occasional sound of my character jumping or shooting on screen. It was quiet, peaceful even, almost too peaceful now that I think about it. I was mid-game, totally focused when I heard this noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft sound like something tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the game. You know, sometimes they add those little background noises to make things seem more real. But then I paused the game, and the sound didn't stop. I sat there for a second, listening. It was faint, but definitely coming from upstairs. Something like a thud, or maybe a creak. It wasn't like the normal house settling sounds you hear at night. This was different, a little too deliberate. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the wind outside or something. Houses make weird noises, right? I forced myself to focus back on the game, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. My eyes kept darting toward the staircase, half expecting to see something standing at the top. But nothing was there. I shook my head and laughed at myself. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered under my breath. Just as I was about to unpause the game, I heard it again. This time, louder. A solid thud from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My heart skipped a beat. I set down the controller and stood up, straining to hear any more sounds. For a few seconds, everything was quiet again. Maybe something had fallen off a shelf, I thought. That had to be it. I mean, what else could it be? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked over to the bottom of the stairs, trying to calm myself down. "Okay, you're alone. There's no one else here. Just go check it out," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded shakier than I'd like to admit. The stairs creaked under my feet as I slowly made my way up, and each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway upstairs was darker than I remembered, but I didn't bother turning on the lights. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit to myself that I was starting to get freaked out. I stopped halfway up, listening. The air felt thick, like I was holding my breath. That's when I heard it again. A low, muffled thump, this time from my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness inside. My stomach twisted. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether to go in or just bolt back downstairs. But I had to check. It's my house, right? What could actually happen? I pushed the door open just a bit more, and it creaked loudly into quiet. "Hello," I called out, though I wasn't sure why. It's not like I expected an answer. The room was empty, or at least it looked empty. I flicked on the light switch, flooding the room with light. The bed was made. Everything looked normal, except for one thing: the window. It was slightly open, and the curtains were fluttering a little. A breeze. That's all it was. The wind must have knocked something over, right? I took a deep breath and walked over to the window, closing it and locking it tight. I glanced around the room again, feeling a bit silly for getting so worked up. I checked the closet just to be sure. Nothing unusual. I was alone. Still, as I headed back downstairs, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just the wind. That was the logical explanation, after all. But even as I sat back down and picked up my controller, I kept glancing toward the stairs, waiting to hear that sound again. We stood in the yard, breathing hard, waiting for the flashing lights of the police cars to show up. The night air felt sharp against my skin, a harsh contrast to the suffocating tension inside the house. Every second felt like an hour as I tried to calm myself down, but my mind kept racing. Every shadow, every rustle of the trees made my heart leap in my chest. Jake stood next to me, glancing back at the house, his face tight with concern. "What the hell happened in there, man?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but I could hear the fear behind it. I shook my head, still trying to process everything. "I don't know." I kept hearing these noises, and then the window in the kitchen was open. And then someone was in the house upstairs. They followed me into the basement. My voice broke as I remembered the soft voice behind the door, the hand gripping the frame, and the slow, deliberate knocking. "Did you see anyone?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning the house, as if someone might be watching us from one of the windows. "Just a hand," I muttered, still feeling the chills crawl up my spine at the memory. I didn't see their face. They were right outside the basement door talking to me. I thought they were coming in, but then they just stopped. Jake looked at me, his brow furrowed. Stopped? Why? I don't know, I whispered. Maybe because you showed up? They must have heard you come in and bolted. We both stared at the house, its dark windows staring back like cold, empty eyes. The street was eerily quiet, and for a moment, it was like the world had shrunk down to just us, standing there in the dark, with that house behind us full of shadows and unanswered questions. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard the faint wail of sirens. The cops were finally on their way. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with fear. I didn't want to go back inside. Even with the cops there, the idea of stepping back into that house, where I had felt so vulnerable and hunted, made me feel sick. I think they're almost here, Jake said, his voice shaking a little. They'll search the place, make sure it's clear. You don't have to go back in there tonight. I nodded, hugging myself tightly. I didn't want to think about what they might find, or worse, not find. What if the intruder was gone? No evidence, no footprints, no sign of forced entry? Would anyone even believe me? Then, as we stood there, I noticed something strange. The front door, the one Jake had slammed shut, wasn't completely closed. It was cracked open just an inch or two. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen it open, but there it was slightly ajar, like someone had left it that way on purpose. Jake, I whispered, pointing toward the door. He followed my gaze and stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching toward his pocket, where his phone was. Didn't I close that? He muttered, taking a cautious step forward. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Don't, I hissed. What if they're still inside? We both stood frozen, staring at the door. It swayed slightly, as if moved by a breeze, but the air was still. My stomach churned with dread. What if they hadn't left after all? What if they were waiting for us to let our guard down? Suddenly, the faintest sound came from inside the house. A creak, like a footstep on the old wooden floor. My heart leaped into my throat. Jake and I exchanged a look, both of us realizing the same thing at once. Whoever had been inside the house was still there. Before either of us could react, the sirens grew louder, and 2 police cars pulled up in front of the house. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. 2 officers stepped out of the car, one of them already reaching for his flashlight as they approached us. Are you the one who called? One of the officers asked, his eyes flicking from me to Jake, taking in the situation with a professional calm that made me feel a little safer. Yeah, Jake said quickly, nodding. There's someone inside. We don't know who, but they've been in the house for a while. My friend was downstairs hiding. The officer's expression hardened, and he motioned to his partner. Stay here, he instructed us. We're going to check it out. They moved toward the house, one of them drawing his gun, the other shining a flashlight ahead as they stepped cautiously through the front door. Jake and I stood there, barely breathing, watching as the officers disappeared inside. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the flashing lights of the police cars and the low murmur of the night. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and I kept staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, suddenly a shout came from inside the house. Hands where I can see them. Jake and I jumped, our eyes wide. There was a commotion, scuffling, voices, and then the 2 officers reappeared at the door, dragging someone with them. My heart dropped as I saw who it was. It wasn't some masked stranger, some terrifying figure who had broken in to hurt me. It was my neighbor, Mr. Howard, the old man who lived next door, the one who always waved at me when I mowed the lawn, the one who'd lived in that house for as long as I could remember. He was muttering something under his breath, his hands cuffed behind his back as the officers led him down the front steps. He looked dazed, confused, his eyes wild and unfocused. I didn't mean to scare anyone, he was saying. I just wanted to check on him. I stared in disbelief, my brain struggling to catch up. Mr. Howard? I whispered, looking at Jake for some kind of confirmation that this was real. Jake looked as stunned as I felt. Dude, why was he in your house? The officers led Mr. Howard to the squad car, and one of them came over to talk to us. Do you know this man? He asked. Yeah, I said slowly, still trying to make sense of it. He lives next door. He's harmless. Why was he in my house? The officer glanced back at Mr. Howard, who was now sitting in the back of the police car, staring out at us with a vacant expression. We'll have to talk to him, but from what we gathered, he thought you were in danger. Apparently, he's been watching the house for a while. He said he noticed something off and wanted to make sure you were okay." My blood ran cold. "He's been watching the house?" The officer nodded. "Yeah, says he's been checking in on you, keeping an eye out." A chill crept up my spine. All those times I thought I was being watched, all the noises, the open window. It wasn't a random intruder. It was him. "He broke in?" Jake asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The officer sighed. "That's what it looks like. He doesn't seem violent, though. Probably just confused. We'll take him down to the station, see what's going on with him." As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Mr. Howard had been inside my house, creeping around, watching me, but not out of malice. He thought he was protecting me. The officers started to leave, taking Mr. Howard with them, and I stood there on the lawn, completely shaken. Jake put a hand on my shoulder, his face still pale. "You okay, man?" he asked. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I really meant it. Because even though the police were gone and Mr. Howard was out of my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off.